Look, it really is quite extraordinary that we are in this situation, that we are debating legislation to prepare this jurisdiction for the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. And I think it is primarily due to the complete disconnect of British politicians, and to a large extent from their own people, I believe, but more so their disinterest and their lack of interest in the implications for other countries, and in particular Ireland. And it really is the implications that this will have. I suppose we all know it, but you discover new elements of it every day. I had a conversation with, and as every sector was potentially impacted, and obviously food and drink is first and foremost, and agri-food, but there's new industry. I had a conversation with a florist recently. A no-deal Brexit would have a devastating impact on the flower industry because the amount of flowers that come across the land bridge. And I'm sure that there are people in the Department of Agriculture that would have been looking at this and so on, but there are so many sectors right across the board that are impacted on this. So many thousands upon thousands of jobs. And I know that a no-deal Brexit could potentially lead to 50,000 job losses in the first year. That is of an absolutely enormous scale, and that's not, I don't believe the government will dispute that, that's state data. This bill, why we will support it, is in a sense a minimum. It is the very absolute things that need to be done by primary legislation. Some things are said that they can be done by secondary legislation, but it is very much about legislation trying to do the bare minimum in as short a time frame as possible. While the context of that I can understand, there is a need for far more. I believe that there is a need for outlining the kind of investment that will be required. Sinn Féin believes in a dual strategy for dealing with a no-deal Brexit. The first is through mitigating its effects through state measures, and the second is to overcome disruption through medium to long-term investment in capital and social infrastructure. And my colleague, Deputy David Cullinane, launched a proposal for a €2 billion Brexit contingency plan for this investment that's required to support exporters and manufacturers and producers who are largely or wholly exporting to Britain, to support business, ensuring commercial exporters are properly protected, supporting in all the regions, including public transport in terms of infrastructure. And the issue of Laoghaire has got a substantial airing, but also Ringaskiddy, Foynes and other ports such as that. The only way to fully, it's impossible, unfortunately, to make Ireland entirely Brexit-proof, but the only way to protect to the best extent possible the worst effects of Brexit is investment. We also need to see more in terms of bespoke solutions for the state to be able to ease the rules on state aid. We've long been critical of some of the way that state aid rules have been applied long before Brexit in a way that's restricted public bodies and public enterprise. And it's, I suppose, it's extraordinary really that we haven't sought more flexibility already, but I think that in this context we need to seek flexibility on state aid, particularly in the agri-food industry, but in a wide variety of other sectors as well. And I hope that Europe will accede to that. I want to address specifically some of the justice issues now, and I suppose the issue of cooperation across justice issues has been, I suppose, an emerging development over 30 or 40 or 50 years through not only the EU but international conventions, the Council of Europe and so on. There is far more integration and cooperation on justice and security matters than ever before, and that's right and proper. This, however, an awful lot of the more formal mechanisms, but there are conventions and so on, but some of the more formal mechanisms are based on EU infrastructure. And unfortunately, that has been potentially substantially eroded. It is very likely that it has been eroded by these changes. I suppose I know one area that could have benefited from was recently we discussed the mutual recognition of probation judgments and decisions regarding probation, community service and so on. And unfortunately that's a new EU proposal we're transposing into Irish law now, but it will not benefit people who are, for example, convicted and given a sentence that involves probation in the north. It doesn't allow them to serve that in the south if they're resident there, and east-west. This is an area of European law that would have been beneficial to the offender, to the jurisdictions, to the community as a whole, but then we won't benefit from. There are other areas that aren't dealt with in this legislation. I'll come to the issue of extradition. The issue of bail. I suppose it's not dealt with in this legislation. The Minister says this doesn't require primary legislation. I hope that's right. There has already been issues in relation to cross-border cooperation and communication on people observing bail and on breaches of bail. So that is one that we will be watching out for. As I say, the Minister is confident it doesn't require primary legislation. We shall have to see. And there is also the issue of civil jurisdiction for issues for torts and so on. And it's not necessarily clear how that shall apply either. So there's a great deal that requires clarification. Some of these issues we may seek to table amendments on. The extradition legislation brings us back to the Act of 1965, which is based on a 57 Council of Europe Convention. There is also a substantial section on non-refoulement, which I think is sensible. I think that perhaps there is actually room for enhancing the scope of the non-refoulement consideration, because there are other jurisdictions have a more expansive understanding of that. But in both those instances and several other instances, I would say that there is, I think we need to take into account the fact that while the British government at the moment is ruling it out, like there are many influential people within the Conservative Party who would have Ireland exit the European Convention on Human Rights and renounce the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think we need to take that into consideration, and I think we need to provide for it, and we need to ensure that our legislation is robust enough for that to happen, and that we're in a position to revise our legislation if that does happen, and if the standards of human rights that pertain in that jurisdiction recede because of a desire, and we've already seen the appetites that's there, a desire to reduce the human rights protections. One of the last issues there I want to touch on, and I'm just going to quote from Brian Gormley of the Commission on the Administration of Justice. We had lengthy hearings on the rights of citizens in the North post-Brexit, and indeed, generally speaking, and I'm just going to quote what he said. The citizenship issue is an example of how basic assumptions of the Good Friday Agreement have been undermined. It recognises the birthright of the people of Northern Ireland to hold Irish or British citizenship on the basis of equality. The basic breach of this principle of equality by Brexit would be that Irish citizens would remain EU citizens, whereas British citizens would not. It amounts to a new focus of division between the two main communities. It has also become clear that Brexit could make the status of Irish citizens born in Northern Ireland constitutionally and practically insecure. If Brexit goes ahead, Irish citizens will be EU citizens living in a non-member state. He goes on to outline three possibilities for how this would be resolved. And then he continues, none of these options are appealing, as they involve the implication that those who choose Irish identity are in some way second-class citizens. Their rights as full participants in Northern Ireland life would depend on either denial of their Irish nationality, as yet unknown bilateral agreements between the UK and Ireland about their common travel area, or asking the Home Office to graciously allow them the leave to live in the land of their birth. The reality is that Irish citizens born and living in Northern Ireland have no legal connection to the jurisdiction in which they were born. Legislation is needed both in the UK and Ireland to recognise the particular status of Irish citizens born in the North and their unequivocal right to participate fully in that region as fully as feasible in Irish society, and full equality in the rights of British and Irish citizens can access. A treaty enshrining these provisions in international law would repair some of the damage done to the principle of these agreements. These issues have been well flagged, and I think that the government should reflect on them and should consider amendments. It's clearly said there, it's been a view shared by many academics, that there are changes needed, not only in British legislation, but in Irish legislation, to ensure clarity on the basis of Irish citizenship for those living in the North and how they can assert that. And I would ask the government to look at that, because there is a clear shortfall there, there is a clear gap, and Irish citizens living in the North could potentially be seriously disadvantaged by it.
Thank you very much for your contribution.